Scientists estimate the age of the Earth to be 4.5 billion years. The earliest life forms may have first appeared on Earth about 3.5 billion years ago. Scientists estimate modern humans have been on the Earth for 200,000 years. World population may have been only 1 million people just over 10,000 years ago. In 1800, the world's population approached 1 billion people. We still knew very little about the world beyond our own borders. Photography was invented just over 150 years ago. It changed the way we learn about the world and our place in it. The past 100 years have provided the most dramatic changes in human history. World population grew from 1.65 billion people to 7 billion people. Technology advanced at an unprecedented pace, making global communications instant. And close to 200 million people were killed by war. The people and events of the last 100 years represent the first 100 years of a new global reality. Just over 100 years ago, most of the world was ruled by powerful kings, queens, and emperors. The British Empire was at the height of its power. The Industrial Revolution was in full force in Europe. Germany and Italy were growing and starting to challenge Britain and France. They were competing with each other for land and economic power. Asia and Africa were for the most part still under control of their European colonizers. China was closed to most of the outside world. America was beginning to emerge as an international industrial power. With increasing rivalry among the European powers, the rise of Japan and the United States, the stage was set for a major upheaval in world affairs. At the start of the 20th century, world population was 1.65 billion people. The Eiffel Tower in Paris was the tallest building in the world. Movies were new. They were black and white and silent. Booker T. Washington published his book, Up from Slavery. Just 50 years earlier, slavery was legal in the United States. Radio was being developed. Electricity was just beginning to be used in people's homes. The story of aviation began when the Wright brothers first flew in 1903. 255 meters in 59 seconds. Albert Einstein calculated that E equals mc squared, and modern physics was born. It would play a dramatic role in the times to come, as people continued to unlock new and more powerful ways of creating and using energy. In other parts of the world, Japan and Russia ended their war over land in Manchuria. Japan took the land, and then moved on to take over Korea as well. In Russia, people were left with great hardship following the war. They continued to look for new ideas. There would be many struggles for people's rights over the next century. One of the first was led by Mohandas Gandhi, who was fighting for the rights of Indian people in South Africa. He wouldn't use weapons. Oil exploration and production began to boom as the automobile was being developed. The Ford Motor Company introduced the Model T. Some think there were just 8,000 cars and less than 200 miles of paved roads in the United States in the beginning of the 1900s. In 1908, Jack Johnson became the first black heavyweight champion of the world. While the next year, Louis Blériot of France became the first person to fly across the English Channel. 1910. World population was 1.75 billion people. People continued to make advances in medicine, and they continued to look for better ways to live. The Mexican Revolution began. Pancho Villa was in the Mexican Revolution. It started as an uprising by farmers to protect their livelihoods, as they couldn't own any of the land they farmed. It turned into a bloody civil war that reshaped the nation. In China, a 6-year-old was emperor. The Titanic took its one voyage in 1912. While just a few months earlier, Roald Amundsen had taken a voyage to Antarctica, the last unexplored continent on Earth, and discovered the South Pole. Women in Britain and America were standing up for the right to vote. The Panama Canal was completed. It connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and brought the world closer together. World War I started in the same year. The war began when Austria-Hungary Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated. many think it would have happened anyway, as the world's powers had been building up their armies for years. The Red Baron was in World War I. Mata Hari was in World War I. Winston Churchill was in World War I. Many people were in World War I. Countries from many parts of the world participated. Some still used pigeons to carry messages. But the weapons they used were now very different. Planes, tanks, and poison gas. For years. Close to 10 million people were killed in the fighting, and millions more from its far-reaching effects. World War I officially ended in 1919, when the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Germany didn't want to sign the treaty. It left them very poor, and with little hope for the future. George Clemenceau of France was at the signing. He predicted a renewed war with Germany would happen by 1940.
Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice.
World War I changed the world dramatically. Belgium, France, Germany, and Russia were all badly damaged. The great empires of Europe fell. New nations were formed and old borders were redefined. Many people in Europe were forced to live as refugees, with no place to call home. The Treaty of Versailles put the blame for World War I on Germany. It required them to make penalty payments to other countries for the damage caused in the war. These penalties would take decades to pay and forced more hardship on the German people. In Russia, decades of extreme poverty under the Tsar's rule and further devastation caused by World War I led to a revolution, civil war, and the execution of the Tsar and his family. The revolution was led by Vladimir Lenin. It gave rise to the Soviet Union, the world's world's first communist state, which would become a major influence in world affairs for the next 70 years. The United States was largely unharmed by the war and continued to grow and prosper. In 1920, world population was 1.86 billion people. The League of Nations was formed to promote peace and prevent world war in the future. Prohibition made it illegal to drink alcohol in America. Baseball was popular. Babe Ruth joined the Yankees. Women in the United States won the right to vote. They also started cutting their hair and shortening their skirts. The first Miss America pageant was held the next year. King Tut's tomb was discovered in Egypt in 1922. Irish people were fighting to gain their independence from British rule. American Indians were made citizens of the United States. While racism was still prevalent, and African Americans were a long way away from having civil rights. Wrote Winnie the Pooh as Adolf Hitler began his rise to power in Germany. Al Capone was the top gangster in America. He organized and controlled the illegal sale of liquor and made a fortune. Duke Ellington led music into the Jazz Age, as Pablo Picasso was painting. And F. Scott Fitzgerald had written The Great Gatsby. Charles Lindbergh successfully completed the first transatlantic flight in 1927. He landed safely in Paris, where Coco Chanel was making women's fashions popular. The United States stock market crashed in 1929. People prepared for more change ahead. In 1930, world population was 2.07 billion people. The Chrysler Building in New York was the world's tallest building. Until 1931, when the Empire State Building was completed. It cost over $40 million. And was built while most people in the United States and around the world were struggling through the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a worldwide economic downturn that started at the same time as the crash of the U.S. stock market. It was the largest and most severe economic depression of the 20th century. Many people lost their jobs. Bank failures cost many people their life savings, and bank robbers like John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde became folk heroes. The auto industry had become the most important segment of the U.S. economy. Yet in the Depression, few people had money to buy cars. Farming in rural areas suffered, and a severe drought crippled the agricultural heartland of the United States. The decline in the U.S. economy pulled down most other countries around the world as well. The Great Depression wasn't the only challenge people had to overcome in the 1930s. In India, Mohandas Gandhi and his supporters organized the Salt March, the first major protest in the struggle for India's independence from Great Britain. They would continue their struggle until they succeeded, and they wouldn't use weapons. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin was the general secretary. He launched a plan that became known as the Great Terror. a political campaign that removed people from their homes and sent them to remote parts of the country if Stalin thought they had ideas different from his own. Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. As movies were becoming more popular, and people continued to make advances in science and technology, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933. He soon removed Germany from the League of Nations. Then, in 1936, he hosted the world at the Berlin Olympics, which many think he planned to use as a showcase for German superiority. Jesse Owens of the United States ruined Hitler's plan by winning 4 gold medals. Also in 1936, the Spanish Civil War started. Then Japan invaded China, as Robert Goddard was developing rockets for space in the United States. And Zeppelins were flying people across the Atlantic, until the Hindenburg airship crashed. In 1938, Great Britain's Prime Minister Chamberlain visited Germany, as Hitler had recently repudiated the Treaty of Versailles and was building a more powerful army.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Chamberlain left confident there was no threat of war, and he proclaimed peace in our time to the world. Germany invaded Poland a couple of months later, and a Second World War began. Many more people were in World War II. Countries from almost every part of the world participated. Winston Churchill was there again. And pigeons were still used to carry messages. But the weapons had changed. Planes flew higher and farther. Tanks were bigger and faster. There was fear of more poison gas. And many battles took place at sea. As of December 7th, 1941, the United States had not yet entered the war.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
They did the next day. World War II continued. In Europe, the Pacific, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and Africa. It became the most violent and deadly conflict in the history of the world.
Many people think that the best way to escape war is to dwell upon its horrors and to imprint them vividly upon the minds of the younger generation. They flaunt the grisly photographs before their eyes. They fill their ears with tales of carnage. They dilate upon the ineptitude of generals and admirals. They denounced the crime and insensate folly of human strife. Now all this teaching ought to be very useful in preventing us from attacking or invading any other country, if anyone outside a madhouse wished to do so. But how would it help us if we were attacked or invaded ourselves? That is the question we have to ask.
In 1944, after 5 years of fighting, the Allied leaders decided to invade Normandy, France, which earlier in the war had been captured by the German army. This became known as D-Day. It led to Germany's surrender in Europe. The war was ended differently in the Pacific. First in Hiroshima, and then 3 days later in Nagasaki. Close to 60 million people were killed in World War II. Almost 3% of the population of the entire world. When World War II ended, people around the world celebrated. And they started to rebuild again. Air raids used throughout the war resulted in massive damage, especially all over Europe, where most of the fighting took place. Many cities, including some with no military purpose, were destroyed. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as superpowers. They had the biggest armies, and both left large military forces in many areas of the world, well beyond their own borders. While they fought together in the war, they had very different ideas for the future. They created the Iron Curtain, an imaginary divide of land and people of Europe based on territories occupied by Western and Soviet forces at the end of World War II. The Iron Curtain started in Berlin. Meanwhile, the United Nations was being formed to replace the League of Nations in the hope of preventing war in the future. The United States was again largely undamaged by the war. Baseball was still popular. Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier when he joined the Dodgers in 1947, although racism was still prevalent. Chuck Yeager flew through the speed of sound. Elsewhere, people in India, using peaceful non-compliance, gained their independence from Great Britain. Mohandas Gandhi was killed the next year. But not before he left a message of peace for the future. In 1948, the Declaration of Human Rights was signed, while more new borders and boundaries were being created. The State of Israel was formed. Indonesia gained its independence from the Netherlands. Decolonization continued in Africa. And, after over 20 years of civil war, Mao proclaimed the People's Republic of China. The United States and Soviet Union continued to develop and test atomic and hydrogen bombs. The Soviet Union completed their first successful test Joe won in 1949. Now, both the Soviet Union and the United States had nuclear weapons, and the Cold War, the conflict that people around the world would live with for the next 40 years, was just beginning. In 1950, world population was 2.52 billion people. Television was becoming very popular. While a global baby boom that would increase the world's population by almost 4 billion more people over the next 50 years was about to begin. Massive rebuilding efforts and more people coming into the world caused the economies of many countries to grow faster than ever before, adding more fuel to the boom in oil exploration and production. Cars had more powerful engines and were getting faster. The jet engine was being developed, and air travel was taking off. While the Cold War reached Korea, where following World War II, the Soviet Union and Allied troops both occupied the country. They decided to divide the country into North and South at the 38th parallel. The division forced many Korean people out of their homes and separated families. Fighting continued for 3 years. Over 2 million Korean people were killed. And the country was forever divided. Elsewhere, Hillary and Norgay reached the top of the world in 1953. Elizabeth became queen in London, while Elvis became king in America. The United States Supreme Court decided it was wrong to allow public schools to determine admission based on race. And the civil rights movement in America started to gain momentum. Although equal rights still wouldn't come easily. South Africa, a law called apartheid imposed segregation of people based on race. Nelson Mandela challenged this law and would soon be imprisoned for his belief. Back in America, Ray Kroc opened his first McDonald's. Jonas Salk gave the world the polio vaccine. And Walt Disney's dream became a reality in California. While in the Soviet Union, in 1957, Sputnik was launched. It became the first satellite to successfully orbit the Earth, and the space race began. In 1960, world population was 3.02 billion people. John F. Kennedy was about to become President of the United States.
The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life.
Cold War tensions went higher when the U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. And higher still when Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. People in the Soviet Union cheered, while America watched. Cold War tensions were also rising in Germany, where following World War II, the country had been divided into East and West. Living conditions had become very different between the two states. As more people started leaving East Germany to find a better way of life elsewhere, a wall was built to stop them. The Cold War moved on to Cuba, where Fidel Castro was prime minister. And where the world watched the United States and the Soviet Union threaten each other with nuclear weapons during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The space race continued as America put a man into orbit.
Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth.
John F. Kennedy was killed in 1963, but not before he left a legacy of possibility for the world.
My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
The Beatles invaded America. While the Cold War invaded Vietnam. Many people were in the Vietnam War. The United States increased their military in the area from 16,000 troops to over 500,000 troops in 1968. Military service was mandatory in America when the Vietnam War began. And the question of whether or not to go to war again divided the country. Many protests were held against the war. And many people refused to go. Muhammad Ali was one who refused. He fought for this right for 4 years. He eventually won a unanimous decision at the Supreme Court. The civil rights movement in America continued to move forward. Although one of its leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. was killed in 1968. He led efforts for rights to vote, desegregation, labor rights, and basic civil rights. And he didn't use weapons.
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty! We are free at last!
Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. While back on Earth, many young people were searching for new ways to express themselves and their ideas of peace and freedom that took center stage in America when Jimi Hendrix played the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock. In 1970, world population was 3.7 billion people. The first Earth Day was organized as people started looking at the planet and ourselves in new ways. The gay rights movement was gaining momentum, and many protests over the war in Vietnam continued, including one that turned tragic at Kent State University in America. The Olympic Games returned to Germany in 1972, where the world watched the Soviet Union and the United States play for the gold medal in men's basketball. Mark Spitz of America won 7 gold medals swimming, and Olga Korbut of the Soviet Union became the new face of women's gymnastics. Then the Games came to a standstill, as 11 athletes from Israel were taken hostage. Later that year, with Cold War tensions between the Soviet Union and America still continuing, the game of chess made headlines as Bobby Fischer of the United States and Boris Spassky of the Soviet Union played a match for the world title in Iceland. Secretariat won the Triple Crown in 1973. Walter Cronkite was known as the most trusted man in America, while Richard Nixon was president.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Until he left office in 1974 following the Watergate scandal. The Vietnam War came to an end with the fall of Saigon a year later, while an American and a Soviet shook hands in space. And smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel as John Paul II became Pope in Rome. In 1980, world population was 4.44 billion people. In New York, many gathered outside the home of John Lennon to pay their respects. He wrote songs like Imagine. The space shuttle started making regular travel to and from space possible. People were imagining a world without nuclear missiles. And a world without hunger. And they continued to reach for the stars, in spite of the risks. In 1987, the world superpowers agreed to eliminate some of their nuclear weapons. In other parts of the world, people were standing up for liberty in China. They were cleaning up the ocean after the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And they were celebrating everywhere as a wall came down in Germany. In 1990, world population was 5.27 billion people. Nelson Mandela was released from prison. He would go on to become the president of South Africa, and the end of apartheid would soon follow. another revolution was happening in Russia. This one was led by Mikhail Gorbachev. It resulted in the Soviet Union being dissolved and ended the Cold War, leaving the United States as the sole superpower in the world. They had just sent military forces to the Persian Gulf, where a conflict in the home of the world's largest known oil reserves was happening. There were now almost 800 million cars in the world. People were using approximately 75 million barrels of oil a day. And technology was again changing how we connect with and learn about the world. At the turn of the century, there were 6.06 billion people on the planet. The United Nations designated the year 2000 as the International Year for the Culture of Peace. The next year, on September 11, the world stopped and watched as some planes were flown into the World Trade Center towers in New York City. As another war began, people around the world regrouped and continued to look for new and better ideas.
We've done this before. Each and every time a new generation has risen up and done what's needed to be done. Today, we are called once more, and it is time for our generation to answer that call.
In 2008, Barack Obama became president of the United States. The next year, China celebrated the 60th year of the People's Republic and continued to open their doors as they take on a new role in world affairs. The Burj Dubai in the United Arab Emirates became the tallest building in the world. It cost over $1 billion and was completed as people around the world faced new global challenges. In 2010, world population reached 6.7 billion people. It is expected to reach 9 billion people by the year 2050. Advances in science and technology continue to increase our world of possibility and our potential to destroy. There are still many conflicts among people happening on the planet today, and many struggles for human rights and freedom continue. And just as the people and events of the past created the global reality of today, the people of today and the choices we make will create the global reality of tomorrow.